much food on my plate.
Today we're going to talk about nutrition. And nutrition is an important thing because we all love food. It's the field of science that studies the food that we eat. So we need to think about good nutrition. So really, what do you think good nutrition is? Think about the foods that you eat every day. Do you have good nutrition? We all need food. So just think, who doesn't love sitting down to their favorite meal? I want you to think about what your favorite meal is because we're going to talk about that in a sec. Unfortunately, when we think about the foods that we eat, sometimes it can lead to poor health. Obesity is the #1 crisis facing Americans today. For some, sport. Food's a sport, right? Competitive hot dog eating, gotta love it. For some, food's a hobby. We love to cook. We love to garden. But for some, it's a passion. You can make a career out of food. You might actually recognize these famous chefs, Alton Brown and Kat Cora. So think about your favorite meal. It's your birthday, and your family's asked you what you want for dinner, and you can have anything. Think about what you want. Be ready to share a favorite meal when we meet for our upcoming Touchstone session. We're going to talk about your favorite foods. Food's important because it provides your body with the basic building blocks that you need to build and maintain the physical you. It provides the vitamins and minerals and nutrients that direct your daily functions. And it fuels your body. It powers your body's metabolism. So you have to have food. So we're going to talk about the 6 basic nutrients we commonly associate with food. The 6 basic nutrients we commonly associate with food are carbohydrates, lipids, or we call them fats, protein, vitamins, minerals, and water. Water serves lots of different functions in the body. About 60% of your body is made of water. Your body uses water to get rid of waste, like in your urine. Think about all the things that are in your urine. Yuck. It's a good thing we get them out of our body. Then, this third picture here, that should look familiar to you. Remember those sacs at the end of your lungs where gas exchange happens? You see deoxygenated blood get oxygenated. That's the alveoli, and that respiratory surface can't do its job unless it's moist with water. Remember, a good portion of your blood, that plasma, 55% of your blood is plasma, and that's mostly made of water. In order for nutrients that go through your digestive system to get into your blood, you would need water because everything needs to get dissolved. Because what's the universal solvent? You got it, water. Right here, this person's sweating. They're probably pretty hot. Water helps you cool. And that's also one way that you lose water, through perspiration. But you also use it every time you breathe. I love this image. So every time this bird breathes or sings, it's releasing water out into the environment. Now, when we stop to think about your body, again, some of the numbers change depending upon what resource you look at, but 50 to 60% of your body is water, and that's on average. Your muscles are over 70% water. So if it's so important, we need to think about how we keep our body hydrated. Think about the foods that you eat. Between the vegetables and the fruits that you eat, you're going to get a lot of water from those. But really, you should be consuming somewhere between 1 and 3 liters of water a day, especially if you're active. The more active you are, the more water you should be consuming. But think about what you drink. Think very carefully, because if you're consuming things like Coca-Cola, like Red Bull, like iced tea, like coffee, those drinks all have something in common. What do they have in common? They all contain caffeine. And caffeine is a diuretic. A diuretic is a chemical that tells your body it needs to urinate. So those could actually dehydrate you. So stay away from anything with caffeine if you're trying to stay properly hydrated. Or if you're counting your liters of water that you consume each day, don't count the things that contain caffeine. Real important. 2% dehydration is a 10% loss in performance. That's pretty significant. That means that if you're 2% dehydrated and you sit down to take a test, that test that could have been 100 or a 90 all of a sudden becomes a 90 or an 80. Think about your performance in sports. You are 10% challenged if you go into that game dehydrated, or depending upon the level of hydration. So stay hydrated like your life depends on it, because it does. Now, let's talk about proteins. Proteins are long molecules called polymers, and they're made of long chains of molecules called amino acids. You might be familiar with the amino acids when you purchase some of your protein drinks. Um, those protein drinks that you buy are loaded with all of the different types of amino acids, of which there are 20. Um, when we take a look at what your body does with those proteins, most of you would probably tell me that proteins are needed to build muscle, but they're also important in the structure of hair and developing your skin. They're important in the proteins of red blood cells that carry oxygen, and that protein's called hemoglobin. They're also important in pigments like your hair and your skin pigments, your eye pigments, and even plant pigments. Proteins are also important in making hormones like growth hormones, your sex hormones, and things that regulate blood sugar like insulin. So proteins are pretty important. But how do you get them? Well, when we think about the foods that we eat, those are going to be our important sources of proteins. Most of you would probably tell me that proteins come from meats, which is true. They do. That's because they're important to build muscle. But what if you're a vegetarian? And that's when we need to start talking about the diversity of the proteins that you eat, because different proteins are going to be made up of different types of amino acids. Now, if you have a special diet, if you're vegan, if you're vegetarian, then you need to be really concerned about 9 of these amino acids that we call essential amino acids. The essential amino acids are the ones that your bodies can't make, so you have to get them in your diet. So by having a diverse diet, you'll make sure that you get all of those amino acids. Some of your proteins, if you're not going to get them from meat, whether it's pork or chicken or fish or beef, you might want to consider getting your protein from dairy, milk and cheese and yogurt. But again, if you're vegetarian or even vegan, you might want to think about getting the proteins you need from a variety of different nuts or beans and legumes. So if we take a look, there's all kinds of different sources. Even vegetables have proteins, and people tend not to give vegetables a whole lot of credit for being a good source of proteins, but you've got to make sure that you want those deep green leafy vegetables, and even then supplement those food intake with beans and nuts. So get your protein. Now it's time to talk about carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are your number one energy source. And when you take in carbohydrates, you get quick energy from what we call simple carbohydrates or monosaccharides. Monosaccharides are simple sugars, things like honey or sucrose, that white crystally stuff you put on your Cheerios. Complex carbohydrates give you long-term energy. These are much bigger molecules. Often, those are the ones that you think about having to eat maybe the night before a big athletic event. Things like potatoes, rice, or grains that you find in bread or pasta. When we think about carbohydrates, I want you to think about getting a balance of carbohydrates. Sometimes people can talk about good carbs and bad carbs, and I really think it's all about the balance. And how you choose to balance those carb intakes will determine how your body is fueled and whether you lose, maintain, or even gain weight. Good carbohydrates aren't very processed. So you're getting natural foods that are high in vitamins and high in minerals. If you think some of the carbohydrates that we typically think about being bad, they're just highly processed, which means they don't have vitamins and minerals, which we're going to talk about later, or maybe not as many. So think about balancing your carbohydrates. After all, right? They fuel your body. So if we're going to take a look at those carbohydrates, let's take a look at where they come from. Plants are responsible for our carbohydrates. They use sunlight energy and power the process of photosynthesis to be able to make sugars. When we consume those sugars, remember our unit on cells? Do you remember the organelle that's in charge of using that sugar? Yes, it's the mitochondria. And the mitochondria takes the sugar that we consume, the glucose, and combines it with the oxygen that we've breathed in and has been delivered to our cells by red blood cells. And from that, our body makes energy, or ATP. Now, not all carbohydrates are used to power our bodies. As a matter of fact, a very important carbohydrate is associated with plants, and we call that fiber or cellulose. Fiber you have to consume, but our body doesn't digest it. Instead, that fiber passes through our digestive system and actually leaves with our nutritional waste, stuff that we either don't have time to use or that we can't use. Now, when we think about how much of our diet should be carbohydrates, really about 50%, maybe a little bit more if you're an athlete, but about 50% of your daily calories should come from carbohydrates. Now, let's talk about that. A calorie is how we measure energy. 1 gram of carbohydrate is going to give you 4 calories per gram. You need a lot of energy to power your day. So let's give it up for carbohydrates.